There are two dead men who, if you sat them at the same table, would probably argue for 6 straight hours about almost everything, and yet somehow they land on the exact same warning. One of them spent his life mapping dreams, symbols, and the unconscious mind. The other spent his life smashing every comfortable lie a society ever told itself, with a hammer on purpose. Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche disagreed about religion, about morality, about the soul itself, but they agreed on the one thing that matters most for this video. You are not free. Not yet. Something has been quietly operating you since before you could vote, drive, or even tie your own shoes. And most people spend their entire lives never realizing the hand on the wheel was never theirs to begin with. That is the spell we are breaking open today, from 2 completely different directions. Because honestly, one philosopher alone was never going to be enough to fully expose something this well hidden. Quick disclaimer before we start. Dressed up as a joke so the next 40 minutes go down a little easier. Nietzsche once wrote that God is dead, and somewhere out there right now a guy is using that exact sentence to win an argument at a dinner party without having read a single page of the book it came from. Do not be that guy. Stay for the whole thing, because both of these men built far more careful arguments than the one-liners history flattened them into. Let us start with Jung, because he built the basement this entire house sits on. Jung believed the mind is not one single, unified, rational thing quietly making decisions behind your eyes. He believed it is layered, like a house with rooms you have never personally entered. The room you actually live in, the one that believes it is steering everything, he called the ego. The ego is sincere. It genuinely believes it chooses your relationships, your career, your reactions, your entire personality, top to bottom. It does not. Beneath it sits the personal unconscious, a storage closet packed with buried memories and old wounds you stopped thinking about decades ago but never actually resolved. Beneath that sits something even stranger. The collective unconscious, a layer of mind Jung believed every human being inherits, built across thousands of generations of survival, myth, and instinct. Living inside that layer are what he called archetypes: the hero, the caregiver, the orphan, the trickster, the tyrant, the sage. Ancient characters quietly auditioning right now for the lead role in your one and only life. Here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. You did not choose which archetype runs your script. It chose you, usually before the age of 7, based on whichever role kept you safest or earned you the most love in a household you had 0 say in choosing. Were you the family fixer as a kid? The caregiver took the wheel, and you will spend your adult life loving people who need saving, calling it love, when really it is an old survival strategy wearing a wedding ring. Were you taught early that needing things was inconvenient, that your needs made other people uncomfortable? The orphan archetype is steering now, and independence will feel like a personality trait, when really it is a scar that learned excellent posture. Were you the one who always had to be funny, who learned that a room only liked you when you were entertaining it? The Jester archetype has the microphone now, and every silence in your life feels like a personal failure that needs to be filled immediately, whether or not anyone actually asked you to fill it. Notice something about all 3 of those examples. None of them are dramatic. Nobody in that lineup is a villain. These are quiet, reasonable-sounding adaptations a child made to survive an ordinary household, and decades later the adult has no memory of making the choice at all. Because at 7 years old it did not feel like a choice. It felt like the only available option in the room. Jung put this into a sentence sharp enough that it should sit with you for days. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Read that again, slowly. Not notice the pattern. Call it fate. That is the entire mechanism of the spell. It does not hide by being loud or dramatic. It hides by convincing you there was never anything there to notice in the first place. Now, here is where Nietzsche walks into the room, sits down across from Jung, and says, "Fascinating, Carl, truly. Archetypes, the unconscious, lovely framework. But you are still dancing around the actual question underneath all of it. Who told you which archetype was even acceptable to begin with? Who decided the caregiver deserves admiration and the tyrant deserves shame? Who built the entire value system you have been unconsciously obeying without ever once putting it on trial?" Nietzsche's answer is the second half of this spell, and honestly, it might be the more uncomfortable half. Nietzsche argued that most human beings are not living according to values they personally chose. They are living according to values that were handed down to them, generation after generation, by institutions that benefited enormously from keeping people small, obedient, guilty, and grateful for scraps. He called this slave morality, a value system where humility, self-denial, and quiet suffering get rebranded as virtues, not because they are inherently noble, but because a meek, self-doubting population happens to be remarkably easy to manage. Compare that to what he called master morality, where strength, ambition, pride, and the nerve to define your own values are treated as the genuine virtues, the ones that actually built every civilization worth remembering, long before guilt got repackaged and sold back to us as humility. Here is the detail that should make the back of your neck go cold. Nietzsche said most people never even ask which morality they are currently running. They simply absorb whatever their culture, their religion, their parents, and their early fear handed them, and then spend the rest of their life mistaking inherited guilt for personal conscience. You believe you feel bad about wanting more, about taking up space, about real ambition, because that is your own authentic moral compass speaking. Nietzsche would ask a far ruder question. Or did somebody install that exact feeling in you on purpose? Because a person who feels guilty for wanting things is wonderfully, conveniently easy to control. Put Jung and Nietzsche side by side for a moment, and the spell becomes fully visible for the first time. Jung says an unconscious archetype is choosing your behavior beneath the surface. Nietzsche says an unconscious inherited morality is choosing which of those behaviors you are even permitted to feel good about. Together they describe a person walking around fully convinced they are free, while two invisible hands, one psychological, one cultural, quietly steer nearly every major decision they will ever make in an entire lifetime. Here is a small joke buried inside all this darkness, because at this point we have earned one. Nietzsche, the man who told the entire Western world to interrogate every value it had ever inherited, had a mustache so enormous it practically required its own postal code, and somehow nobody in his life ever thought to question that particular decision. Make of that what you will. Let me give you the Nietzsche example now, the same way Jung got one earlier, because theory without a mirror is just trivia nobody remembers by morning. A young man has a real dream. He genuinely wants to build something, take an actual risk, leave the safe job everyone keeps congratulating him for keeping, attempt the thing that actually frightens him. And every single time he gets close, a quiet, polite, deeply convincing voice shows up right on schedule and tells him that wanting that much is arrogant, that he should be grateful for what he already has. That ambition like that is selfish, that good people stay humble, stay small, stay quiet, and do not reach past their station. He listens to that voice every single time, and he calls it wisdom. He calls it maturity. He calls it finally knowing himself. Nietzsche would lean in close and ask one brutal, unavoidable question. Whose voice is that, actually? Is that your own carefully considered judgment, arrived at honestly? Or is that 2,000 years of slave morality, inherited and never once examined, dressed up convincingly as humility, doing precisely what it was originally designed to do, which is keep you small, obedient, and easy to manage from a distance. That is not virtue. That is the spell, wearing a halo it was never actually entitled to. Now, before we move into how both of these men say you actually break this thing, I want to pause here, because this is the part of the video that matters most, and I genuinely do not want you watching it with one thumb already drifting toward the next scroll. If anything said so far has landed even a little, if some part of you has gone quiet in recognition, that is exactly the kind of moment this channel was built around from day one. Every single video here exists to hand you back pieces of yourself that got buried under inherited guilt, unconscious archetypes, and conditioning you never actually consented to in the first place. If you want to keep going deeper into exactly this kind of material, hit subscribe right now, because what comes after this video pushes even further than Jung and Nietzsche combined, and you genuinely do not want to be the person who scrolled past it without looking back. All right, let us finish the case properly. Jung's answer to breaking the spell begins with something he called individuation, the lifelong, often uncomfortable process of separating your true self from the masks and inherited roles you have been unconsciously performing since early childhood. Not destroying the mask entirely, you do need a persona to function inside society. You cannot walk into a funeral wearing the same energy you bring to a bar on a Friday night. The real danger is forgetting that you are wearing one at all. The real danger is when the mask quietly grows into the actual face underneath it. So Jung's practical instruction is this, and it is simpler to say than it is to actually do. Catch the reaction while it is happening, not afterward, not in the shower 3 hours later replaying the conversation. The next time you feel a flash of anger rise out of nowhere, a compulsive need to please someone who has not earned it, an urge to vanish from a conversation that is finally getting honest, pause for exactly one breath and ask yourself, whose voice is this? Is this me right now in this exact moment genuinely choosing this response? Or is this an old archetype performing an old, well-rehearsed script, simply because it once kept a much smaller, much more frightened version of me safe? Then Jung tells you to stop fighting your shadow, all the rejected parts of yourself, the anger, the ambition, the jealousy, sometimes even your own softness if you were raised somewhere that treated softness as weakness, and instead interview it like a witness instead of attacking it like an enemy. What does this feeling actually want? What is it trying, however clumsily, to protect? The thing you cannot stand in another person is very often the exact thing locked away in your own basement, projected outward so loudly that you never have to look directly at it yourself. Nietzsche's answer runs in a completely different direction, and frankly it is louder, sharper, and considerably less gentle. He does not ask you to softly interview your shadow over tea. He asks you to become what he called the Übermensch, a person with the courage to examine every single inherited value, keep the ones that genuinely serve a fuller, stronger, more honest life, and throw out every value that exists purely to keep you obedient and small. He calls this process the revaluation of all values, and it starts with one ruthless question you are required to ask about literally everything you currently believe is right or wrong. Did I actually choose this value myself, or did I simply inherit it? The way you inherit an old coat from a relative, wearing it for years without ever once checking whether it actually fits the person you have become. Nietzsche also leaves us with one of the strangest, most haunting thought experiments in the entire history of philosophy, something he called eternal recurrence. Imagine, he says, that you were forced to live this exact life again. Same choices, same small daily obediences, same swallowed ambitions, same compromises, forever on an endless loop, with zero changes permitted. Would that thought fill you with absolute horror? Or could you honestly say, yes, even this, I would choose it again without hesitation? That single question, in Nietzsche's own words, is the heaviest weight imaginable, and he uses it deliberately as a kind of diagnostic test. If the idea of repeating your current life on an endless loop fills you with genuine dread, that is not a small feeling to wave away and forget by lunchtime. That is information. That is the spell showing you, with total clarity, exactly where its grip is currently tightest. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth laying out before we close the case, because it ties Jung and Nietzsche together in a way that makes the whole picture click into place. Jung, late in his life, started talking about something he called the self, with a capital S, distinct from the small everyday ego. The self, for Jung, was not another mask, not another archetype competing for stage time. It was the entire psyche working in harmony, conscious and unconscious, finally speaking to each other instead of one quietly controlling the other from the basement without permission. Individuation, the lifelong project he described earlier, was never really about defeating the shadow or silencing the archetypes. It was about integration, about every part of you finally getting a seat at the table instead of fighting in the dark for control of a body that only has one steering wheel. Nietzsche, strangely, was reaching for something almost identical, just dressed in completely different language, sharper edges, louder volume. He talked about amor fati, the love of one's fate, which sounds at first like a contradiction of everything we just discussed about refusing to call your conditioning fate. But listen closely to what he actually meant. Amor fati was never about passively accepting whatever life hands you without question. It was about reaching a point where you have done the work, where you have questioned the inherited values, examined the archetypes running underneath your behavior, faced the shadow instead of fleeing from it. And only then, from that hard-earned place of clarity, choosing to embrace your life fully, including its wounds, including its scars, because you finally understand them instead of being unconsciously ruled by them. That is the actual destination both of these men were pointing toward, even if they used wildly different maps to get there. Not the erasure of your wounds, not a clean, sanitized version of yourself with all the difficult parts surgically removed. Something closer to ownership. The difference between a puppet who has never once noticed the strings and a person standing fully upright, aware of every string that was ever attached to them, choosing consciously which ones to keep and which ones to finally cut. Think about the people in your own life who seem, for lack of a better word, free. Not loud, not necessarily successful by some external metric, just genuinely free in a way that is rare and noticeable the moment you are near it. Almost without exception, those people did not get there by accident. They got there by doing exactly what Jung and Nietzsche separately described. They caught themselves mid-pattern enough times that the patterns finally lost their grip. They questioned enough inherited values that the ones still standing were actually, finally, theirs. That is not magic. That is not luck. That is simply what it looks like when a person finally wakes up inside their own life, instead of sleepwalking through someone else's script, wearing their face. Here is the closing argument, and I want you to actually sit with this, instead of letting it slide past you like background noise on a long drive. Somewhere in your life right now, this very week, a pattern is quietly repeating itself, and somewhere underneath that pattern sits a value you never actually chose for yourself. Maybe it is a relationship dynamic that keeps rhyming uncomfortably with the last one, an archetype Jung would recognize instantly from across the room. Maybe it is an ambition you keep secretly strangling in its crib, because some old, inherited voice told you that wanting that much makes you a bad, greedy, ungrateful person, a value Nietzsche would recognize instantly as borrowed rather than earned. Both of these men, working from completely different directions, one armed with a basement, the other with a hammer, arrive at the exact same conclusion. You are not cursed. You were never broken. You are simply unconscious of the forces that have been steering a life you assumed this entire time belonged entirely to you. Neither man promised an easy fix, because the spell would never have survived this long if the cure were genuinely that simple. What they offered instead was slower, harder, and far more real. For Jung, consciousness is the cure, awareness slowly displacing the automatic, one-caught reaction at a time. For Nietzsche, courage is the cure, the willingness to question every inherited value rather than simply wearing it for life because it happened to be handed to you at birth. Put the two together and you finally get the actual exit door out of the spell. See the pattern clearly. Then have the nerve to ask yourself whether you would actually choose it again, forever, on an endless loop, or whether it is finally time to choose something else entirely, something that is actually fully yours. This channel exists to keep pulling threads exactly like this one. One archetype, one inherited value, one buried pattern at a time, until the picture of who you actually are becomes simply too clear to keep ignoring any longer. If anything in this video made you go quiet for even a second, do not let that moment evaporate by tomorrow morning the way most insights quietly do. Subscribe right now because the next video goes even further into the exact value system currently running your decisions without your permission, and the odds are very good that you have never once stopped to question where it actually came from. Until then, here is the question both of these men left sitting on the table for absolutely anyone willing to actually pick it up and look at it directly. If you had to live this exact life again, forever, on a loop, with nothing changed, would you call that fate the way most people quietly do? Or would you finally, for the first time, call it what it actually is, a spell, and start the slow, difficult, completely worthwhile work of breaking it? One last thing before you go, because it matters more than the ending of any single video. None of this works as something you watch once and feel inspired by for an afternoon before going right back to sleep inside the same old script. Jung spent decades on his own individuation. Nietzsche spent his entire intellectual life questioning values most people never even noticed they were carrying. This is not a weekend project. It is closer to a practice, something you return to again and again, each time catching the pattern a little faster, naming the inherited value a little sooner, until eventually the gap between the old automatic reaction and the new conscious choice becomes so small it barely registers as effort anymore. That is what mastery of your own mind actually looks like. Not a single dramatic breakthrough. 1,000 small, quiet catches stacked up over years, until one day you notice the puppet strings are gone. Not because someone cut them for you, but because you finally did.